It has been a wonderful day to get to hear about the work that's going on in Bratislava, to get to hear about the good work, the people who are hearing the gospel in that place, and all of the good things that this congregation supports in that part of the world. What a great day it's been. But as we've been reading through the Bible in this past week, we've learned of a man who had a day that was very much the opposite. A day that would be defined really more by what we know as Murphy's Law. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. Because this past week we began into the book of Job. You ever wonder when something goes wrong, whenever life doesn't seem to be going your way, why me? If anyone ever had a reason to ask that, it was Job. Why me? Why should all of this be? And as a matter of fact, he did ask that throughout the book. Now, as we look at the book of Job, I want to take a little bit of time and kind of introduce the book, the character, the situation, and then we're going to look at some of the lessons that we can learn from this book and what value it has for us today. To begin to answer some of the question, why is this in Scripture? What does this have for us? And so we're going to look at some of that tonight, but let's turn to Job chapter 1, and we'll begin to introduce Job as an individual and his situation and how that all began. So in Job chapter 1, beginning in verse 1, it says, "There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. His possessions also were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and very many servants. That man was the greatest of all the men in the east. His sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When the days of feasting had completed their cycle, Job would send and consecrate them, rising up early in the morning and offering burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, 'Perhaps my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts.' Thus Job did continually." And so we have an introduction to him. He is talked about here at the very beginning of the book as one who is blameless and upright. He's one who fears God. He doesn't live in sin. This is somebody who sets a great example. He's also very wealthy. He's got a large family. And so we see this is quite a guy. We also learned that he has a concern for his family and their situation or their standing with God. He offers sacrifices on their behalf, wanting to make sure that his children are in a right relationship with God. As far as it depends on him, he will do anything he can for them. So we see where his mindset is, and it says he did this continually at the end of verse 5, that this is a way of life for Job. He is interested in serving God. He is interested in being right with God. He is interested in his family being right with God. And then we get to the next section where we get introduced to the situation that this whole book deals with. Verse 6, "There was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, 'From where do you come?' Satan answered the Lord and said, 'From roaming about on the earth and walking around on it.'" That's a scary concept. Verse 8, "The Lord said to Satan, 'Have you considered my servant Job? There's no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil.' Satan answered the Lord, 'Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge about him and his house and all that he has on every side? You've blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. Put forth your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face.' The Lord said to Satan, 'Behold, all that he has is in your power, only do not put forth your hand on him.' So Satan departed from the presence of the Lord." And so we have the beginning of Job's situation. It begins with a conversation in the spiritual realm, a conversation between God and Satan. God's assessment of Job is the same that we saw at the very beginning of the book. He's upright, he's blameless. There isn't anybody else like him. God's assessment of Job is that this man is righteous. This man is doing what he's supposed to. This man wants to serve me. This man is what everyone else ought to be. But Satan's assessment is a little bit different. Satan's assessment, he says, of Job's faith, well, yeah, he's faithful, but it's shallow. He only serves you because you've given him all of these things. He only serves you because of what you do for him. It's all about what he can get out of it. Or in other words, of course he serves you. Look at what you've done for him. You see very different assessments of Job from God and from Satan. So Satan issues this challenge. Let me take what he has away from him, and he won't be quite so faithful. He's not going to be so blameless and upright, righteous. He's not going to fear you. He's not going to turn away from evil. Let me take all of that away from him, and all of this will change. Now, a couple of observations before we get into dealing with the hurt that Job deals with in the chapters that follow. A couple of observations. God is sovereign. Satan had to get permission before he could go and lay his hand on Job. We see where Satan came from. God asked him, Satan, where'd you come from? Roaming about on the earth, walking around on it. Reminds me of what the Apostle Peter wrote, 1 Peter 5:8, that Satan prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. It's exactly where we see him coming from in the book of Job. God said, Satan, where you been? Just looking for somebody to destroy on the earth. And another observation. Revelation chapter 12 and verse 10 labels Satan as the accuser of the brethren. We see him accusing in this context. He accuses Job of having a shallow faith, of having a shallow loyalty. It's only based on things. It's only based on what he gets. You see that accusation being thrown at Job. Oh, he doesn't. Does he serve you for nothing? Let me take that away from him. He won't serve you anymore. He accuses Job of being shallow. But as we get into the text, what we see in the book of Job is someone who's been hurt, who deals with pain that none of us can probably even completely understand. And what we're going to see, and we're going to read a fair amount tonight in the book of Job as we look at different things throughout this book. But one of the universal truths is that everyone has to deal with pain. Everyone hurts from time to time. Now, it's a universal fact of life. We all have difficult and painful situations, but they're not the same for everyone. Some people hurt in different ways than others. Some people are tried in different ways than others. Some may be hurt by financial hardships where others aren't. Some may be hurt through career issues or loss of a friend, through some disunity or struggle. Some may deal with family disunity, loss of a loved one, health problems. Some may have pain because of consequences of their own action. But the fact is, we all deal with pain. We all hurt in some way or another at times. We all either are hurting from one of these or very likely know someone who is. Now, Job was attacked in several ways, and that's what we're going to get into as we look at this concept of hurting and how do we deal with it and what's going on with it. We see Job being attacked in several ways. Picking our reading back up in verse 13, we see that Job, who was recorded as a very rich man, lost all of his possessions, lost all of his riches. Now, on the day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing, the donkeys were feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans attacked and took them. They also slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another came and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 bands and made a raid on the camels and took them and slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And so you have all of these possessions, these things that were recorded at the beginning of the book here that we see that Job was a very wealthy man, have all been taken from him in the course of a single day. financial hardship, financial ruin. But that's nothing compared to what's recorded in the next couple of verses. Verse 18, while he was still speaking, another also came and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And behold, a great wind came from across the wilderness and struck the four corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they died. And I alone have escaped to tell you. He lost his possessions. He lost his children all in the same day. But what we see of Job is that he maintained his integrity. Verse 20 says he fell to the ground and he worshiped. He's deeply upset. He's deeply hurt, but he continues to worship God, and he doesn't blame God, it tells us later on in the text. But that's not the end of Satan's attacks, because Satan comes back and, well, there's another conversation between God and Satan that takes place in the spiritual realm, and God still says that Job is blameless and upright. And Satan says, well, that's because you've only taken what he has. We haven't touched him yet. And so in chapter 2, beginning in verse 3, we read about what goes on there. Have you considered my servant Job? There's no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil. And he still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to ruin him without cause. Satan answered the Lord, skin for skin. Yes, all that a man has, he will give for his life. However, put forth your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh. He will curse you to your face. So the Lord said to Satan, behold, he is in your power, only spare his life. Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a potsherd to scrape himself while he was sitting among the ashes, as if the attacks that Job has already endured isn't enough, as if taking his possessions and his children, taking everything that he's got, isn't enough. Now Satan has caused physical pain to Job. And in the process of this, verse 9 shows that he lost the moral support of his wife. His wife said to him, do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die. And what we've just seen in the first 2 chapters of this book is a man that deals with pain, a variety of different kinds of pain. When all of this comes together, a pain that we can't even really fathom. But because we all deal with pain of some form or fashion, Job is an immensely valuable book because it teaches us several things about it. One of the things that Job wrestled with throughout this book is the question, why? Over and over again, we see Job crying out as he's back and forth with his friends, why? Broadly speaking, we can answer that question because of sin, because we live in a fallen world, because we have an enemy. But in specific situations, that's not so easy to deal with. And that's what we're seeing here in the book of Job. If you'll go with me now to chapter 7, we're going to look at a few different passages. In chapter 7 and verse 20, and this is in the middle of a section where Job is crying out to God. He's not addressing his friends in this section. He's addressing God. And he says in verse 20, have I sinned? What have I done to you, a watcher of men? Why have you set me as your target so that I'm a burden to myself? He's crying out to God. Why are you doing all of this to me? Why? You see him again in chapter 10, beginning in verse 1, I loathe my own life. I'll give full vent to my complaint. I'll speak in the bitterness of my soul. I'll say to God, do not condemn me. Let me know why you contend with me. Is it right for you indeed to oppress, to reject the labor of your hands, and to look favorably on the schemes of the wicked? He's saying these people who aren't righteous, these people who aren't living according to God's commands, these people who aren't trying to serve God, well, they have everything going right. Why are you contending with me? God, why are you against me? You see, Job, they're wrestling with the question, why? And in chapter 16, you might say we see this escalate a bit. in verse 21, where he says, "Oh, that a man might plead with God as a man with his neighbor." We see in a couple of different occasions in this book where Job expresses a desire effectively to take God to court. God, I haven't done anything to deserve this. He wants to plead his case, but as he speaks throughout the book, there's nobody that can stand between God and man. There's nobody that can arbitrate here in this type of a situation. But he's expressing a desire to take God to court for this, to bring a case against God for this. And we'll see God's response to that a little bit later on in the book. But we see that come up a few times here as Job is wrestling with this question of why. It doesn't make sense from Job's standpoint. And throughout the book, he maintains his innocence. It's how he could express such a desire to plead his case before God. We see Job's frustration. We see his despair in his speeches and his prayers throughout the book. But as we consider what goes on throughout this book, the reasons that the book gives for Job's suffering, it's not at all the reasons that, well, his friends, and we're going to look at this in just a moment, that his friends suppose. But the reason is because of the enemy. Because Satan wants to use it to get at him. Satan wants to use this pain to get him to curse God. Satan will cause our pain, and he will use our pain if it will drive a wedge between us and the Lord, because that's his ultimate desire, is to pull us away from the Lord because of his hatred. Because of his hatred for God, because of his hatred for anything and anyone that God loves. And in this case, we see that very thing happening where Satan has caused the pain of Job and is trying to use it to separate him from God. But as we see throughout the book, Job asks this question, why? The book never indicates that Job was told why. Job never got to learn the reason. And when we deal with pain, we don't always get to know why. We don't always get to know the reason why we deal with the problems we do. Why does this issue, why did some problem come up? Why did some catastrophe come up seemingly out of nowhere? We want to know why. But it's not a question we always get to have answered. Just as we see Job didn't. But we do know, as we've studied recently in the Sunday morning adult auditorium class, that one of the tactics that Satan uses is discouragement, despair, depression, because it will weaken our defenses. It will cause us to not fight as much against temptation. It can cause us at times to get angry with God. It can cause us to turn away from Him. And that's exactly what Satan is after as he attacks Job. If you'll just take this away from him, he'll curse you. Satan will use pain and discouragement, depression. He'll use despair. He'll use anything he can to turn us away from God. Job wrestles with the question of why. Everyone hurts, but we don't always get to know why. But as Job is wrestling with this issue, he has some friends that come to spend some time with him. And that's what makes up the majority of the book, is the conversations, the back and forth between Job and his friends. And this book offers some great insights into, well, a little bit of what to do and a whole lot of what not to do when we're trying to help somebody with hurting. Now, before we get into looking at what not to do, I want to talk about the one thing that Job's friends did right. Let's go to Job chapter 2. Because there is one thing they got right. In chapter 2, beginning in verse 11, when Job's 3 friends heard of all this adversity that had come upon him, they came each one from his own place, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, and they made an appointment together to come to sympathize with him and to comfort him. And when they lifted up their eyes at a distance and didn't recognize him, they raised their voices and wept. And each of them tore his robe, and they threw dust over their heads toward the sky. And they sat down on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights, with no one speaking a word to him, for they saw his pain was very great. And at the very beginning, we see something they got right, and that is that they showed up and they wept with him. Romans chapter 12 and verse 15 instructs us as Christians to weep with those who weep. And that's one of the things that we see them doing for this first 7 days that they're there, for this first week. They don't offer him advice. They don't try to correct. They don't try to give any explanation. They simply show up and they spend a whole week weeping with him. You know, sometimes as we're trying to help, and I mentioned before that, you know, we're either hurting or we know someone who is. And so this is something that we can learn from. How do we help those who are in pain? And sometimes the best thing we can do is just show up and offer a moral support, to show up and to let people know that we care. And for the first 7 days, we see that out of Job's friends. They showed up and they wept with him. They showed up, they came. But the text that follows showed that what they did next wasn't so good. Because as soon as they opened their mouths, their comfort really went away, and it turned into more problems for Job, as he finds himself having to argue with them throughout the book. They got plenty of things wrong. And these are lessons that we can learn as we try to help people who are struggling, who are dealing with pain. And that is one of the things that they did. They thought they understood. When they looked at Job's situation, when they see all of this pain, when they see all that he's lost, when they see his health problems, when they see to the point that they didn't even recognize him, when they see all of what's going on with him, they thought they understood what was going on. When in reality, they didn't have a clue. To presume that we understand when we haven't been in someone else's place. To presume that we understand the hurts that someone else is going through. To presume that we know how it feels. To presume that we know why can end up causing more harm than good. We have to be careful. We have to have some humility when we deal with this sort of thing. They thought they understood, but they didn't. They accused him of sin when they had no idea what had happened. In chapter 4, and this is while Eliphaz the Temanite is speaking, chapter 4, beginning in verse 7, he says to Job, "Remember now, whoever perished being innocent? Where were the upright destroyed? According to what I've seen, those who plow iniquity, those who sow trouble, harvest it." He's accusing Job of sin. Job, you've done something to deserve this. You've done something. God doesn't just punish people for nothing. God doesn't bring this kind of hardship on people for nothing. You've done something to deserve this. In chapter 5 and verse 17, Eliphaz is still speaking. "Behold, how happy is the man whom God reproves. Do not despise the discipline of the Almighty." He's saying God is disciplining you for something. Don't turn away from him. Learn from it. Again, the implication is you've done something wrong. God is punishing you. God is disciplining you. Come back to him. Chapter 15, we see yet again, and this is a theme that runs throughout the book. Their accusations, their baseless accusations. Chapter 15, verse 4 again, this is Eliphaz. "Indeed, you do away with reverence and hinder meditation before God, for your guilt teaches your mouth, and you choose the language of the crafty." In other words, they're saying, you're not really being honest about what's going on here. You're in some type of sin, and you're just concealing it. You're not telling us what's going on. Chapter 22, yet again. Beginning in verse 4, "Is it because of your reverence that he reproves you, that he enters into judgment against you? Is not your wickedness great and your iniquities without end? You've taken pledges of your brothers without cause and stripped men naked. To the weary you've given no water to drink, and from the hungry you've withheld bread. But the earth belongs to the mighty man, and the honorable man dwells in it. You've sent widows away empty, and the strength of the orphans has been crushed. Therefore snares surround you, and sudden dread terrifies you. For darkness so that you can't see, and an abundance of water covers you. In other words, this flood of horrible things has come upon you because you've taken advantage of the vulnerable. You've hurt others. You've been cruel. You've been ruthless. You've not been merciful. And so again, there's this accusation that's being thrown at him. Here's all the things that you've done, but there's no truth to it. They accused him of sin. They accused him in chapter 8 of not being straightforward about his situation. In chapter 8, we read of what Bildad the Shuhite says to him in chapter 8, beginning in verse 2. How long will you say these things, and the words of your mouth be a mighty wind? Does God pervert justice? Does the Almighty pervert what's right? You catch what he's saying there, verse 2. How long will the words of your mouth be a mighty wind? Your words don't mean anything. In other words, you're just full of hot air. He's rebuking Job. You're not being straightforward with us. God's not going to be unjust. You've done something to deserve this. And throughout the book, Job maintains his innocence, and he explains to them at one point exactly what they're doing to him and their accusations. In chapter 19, beginning in verse 1, Job responds, how long will you torment me and crush me with words? These 10 times you've insulted me. You're not ashamed to wrong me. He explains to them that their words are not helping him in any way. They're not correcting any wrong because he hasn't done anything to bring this on himself. Remember the beginning of the book. Job's situation began with Satan's accusations. If you let me take this away from him, he'll curse you. Not any of Job's sins, not anything that Job has done to deserve this, but because Satan wants to crush him and pull him away from God. Job maintains his innocence throughout. And he even tells them at one point, if I've done something wrong, I'll listen. I'll correct it. But he challenges his friends. Show me what I've done wrong. Show me where I've sinned. And he says to them that their arguments prove nothing because their accusations are empty. Their assumptions are incorrect. And they assume throughout that, Job, you must have sinned in order to hurt like this. And it's the same assumption that the disciples made in John chapter 9. You remember when they came across the man that was born blind? And the disciples, you remember what they asked? They asked Jesus, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born like this? That assumption that if somebody's hurting, if somebody's in a bad situation, it must be because they've done something wrong. It's the same assumption that we see of Job's friends throughout this book. You've done something to deserve this. But it's baseless. And so there are lessons that we can learn about how to help those whenever they're hurting. But when we look at this book, perhaps the most important thing for us to ask is, when I hurt, where is God? Because you see, throughout all of this, God was not absent. In chapter 2 and verse 3, and this is after Satan has completed his first round of torment. Satan has come back in, and the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There's no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil. And he still holds fast his integrity, although you've incited me against him to ruin him without cause. God was observing. God was there listening as Job cried out. God was there listening as Job worshiped after he'd been hurt, after he'd lost his possessions, after he'd lost his children, after he'd lost everything. God was still there listening. And at the end of the book, he calls everyone to account for what's going on because God was not absent through any of it. In the same way, when we deal with hurts today, God is not absent through any of it, but He's there. He hears, He sees, He pays attention. And He calls people to account for their actions. In chapter 38, we finally get God speaking to Job. Now, Job had spoken presumptuously in a couple of different ways. One, in accusing God of being the one who's behind all of this, and in asking to take God to court. I'm going to plead my case before God. In chapter 38, beginning in verse 1, the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man, and I'll ask you, and you instruct me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who sets its measurements, since you know? Who stretched the line on it? On what were its bases sunk? Who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy?" In other words, Job, do you know what's going on behind the scenes? Do you understand this? Do you have the power? Do you have the knowledge? Were you there? In other words, he's calling Job to account because Job has no idea what lies behind all of this. And yet he's asked, God, why are you contending with me? God, why are you against me? And we know from the beginning, God's not against him. When God and Satan were speaking there at the beginning of chapter 2, God said, you incited me to ruin him without cause. God's not against Job in any of this. As a matter of fact, God has believed in the integrity of Job throughout. A blameless and upright man, there's no one else like him. So God calls Job to account. Chapter 40, verses 6 and following, the Lord answered Job out of the storm and said, gird up your loins like a man, and I'll ask you, and you instruct me. Will you really annul my judgment? Will you condemn me that you may be justified? Do you have an arm like God that you can thunder with a mighty voice like his? You remember Job said, I want to take God to court. I want to contend with him as a man would his neighbor. And God says here, are you going to condemn me? You see, Job has said a few things presumptuously in his frustration and his lack of understanding of what's going on. But you see Job repent. Chapter 42, verse 6, Job said, I retract and repent in dust and ashes. He recognizes that his speaking has been presumptuous. He humbles himself before God. And then in verses 7 and following of chapter 42, God calls Job's friends to account. It came about after the Lord had spoken these words to Job, that the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my wrath is kindled against you and against your friends, because you've not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Now, therefore, take for yourselves 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and offer a burnt offering for yourselves. And my servant Job will pray for you, for I will accept him, so that I may not do with you according to your folly, because you've not spoken of me what's right, as my servant Job has. So Eliphaz the Temanite, and Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite went and did as the Lord told them, and God accepted Job. God called those to account who had spoken inaccurately about Job's situation. Where was God throughout all of this? He was listening. He saw Job's integrity, that he continued to worship, that he continued to revere God, that he continued to maintain his innocence, that he continued to be humble before God, even though he was frustrated. He didn't turn away from God. But he also heard the words that were spoken inaccurately by his friends. And God called all of them to account. Where is God when we hurt? He's there listening, he's there seeing. And he's still on his throne. God was and is and always will be sovereign and worthy of praise. One of the things that Job realized throughout this whole ordeal, chapter 1 and verse 20, he arose, he tore his robe, he shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and worshiped. Chapter 1, verse 22, through all this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. Chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, when his wife said to him, "Curse God and die," he said, "That's foolish. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity?" In all this, Job didn't sin with his lips. In chapter 13 and verse 15, even in expressing frustration, he says, "Though he slay me, I will hope in him. Nevertheless, I'll argue my ways before him." So even in saying, I want to argue my case, he says, I'm still going to put my hope in him. You see, Job's still recognizing God being on the throne. Job's not the easiest book to read, as we see someone who's hurting at a level that we can't really understand. But it offers us a lot of valuable lessons. We know that everyone hurts from time to time, but it tells us that we don't always get to know why, but that we can trust God no matter what. Because He is still sovereign, He is still on the throne, He is still in control, He still loves us, He is still good, He is still kind, He is still righteous, and He's still worthy of our praise, no matter what happens. We get some lessons about how we can help others, and maybe some lessons more about how not to from Job whenever we see someone else that's hurting. But most importantly, we learn where God is when anything's going on. He doesn't abandon us, but He's still right there, and He is still worthy of our worship and our praise. We can absolutely trust in Him even when situations happen that we don't understand. We don't know why, and we may never get to know. But God is still able to be trusted. And we see that in Job. We see that come through clearly. Even though throughout to Job it looks like God has been attacking him, what we see behind the scenes is that God was praising Job in the heavenly places. Blameless and upright. There's no one else like Him. We see a God that still loved him in the midst of all of that pain, even though he didn't get to know why. We might not know why things happen to us the way they do sometimes, but we can absolutely trust that God is sovereign, that He hears, that He sees, and that He will absolutely always do what's right. And that's a God that's worth serving. That's a God that's worth following. That's a God that's worth bowing before. That's a God that's worth choosing to follow after. You have the opportunity tonight, no matter what situation you may be in. If as a Christian you've not been following Him as closely as you should, or you need to recommit yourself to Him, if you need to repent and come back to Him, we serve a God that will accept and will forgive. Or tonight, if you need to make the decision to begin a walk with Him, you have the opportunity to be united with Jesus in the waters of baptism. We serve a God who stands ready and who wants to forgive. And you have the opportunity tonight. And if we can help you in that, would you come while we stand and sing?